Hello, everyone, and good morning. Welcome to another episode of the Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Ty, and I'm an educator here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, and I'm super excited to be with you today to talk about my favorite marine mammal, the sea otters. So just like always, though, we encourage you to join us on our adventure today, and we're going to be taking some observations. We're going to be looking at the otter habitat, some sea otter adaptations, and then we're going to talk about the conservation of otters and why they're so important to their ecosystem, and some of the ways that here at the aquarium that we're helping out to boost the populations of our sea otters out in the wild. So like I said, we're going to be taking lots of observations, and we want to hear from you throughout our program today. So if you want to share your observations or ask questions at any point, feel free to text us at the number that you see on the screen at 562-286-1838. Or alternatively, you can also email us at live@lbaop.org. All right, so once again, feel free to send us all your observations or questions. We would love to hear from you. All right, let's jump into what we're going to be talking about today, the adorable sea otter. Now, before we go and talk about the very cool adaptations that sea otters have, I want to sort of zoom out for a second and talk about what it means to be a marine mammal. I mentioned that we're talking about my favorite marine mammal, the sea otter, but what does that even mean? And can you think of any other examples? So let's go ahead and take a second. Maybe you can think of what characteristics make a mammal, or maybe if you're watching this, look around your room right now and see if you can spot a mammal where you're at right now. Go ahead and take a second, and then we'll come back together and talk about what makes a mammal. And in the meantime, we'll check in our Kelp Forest habitat here. So go ahead and just take a second, and we'll be right back to talk about what makes a mammal. Okay, so maybe if you were looking around your room, you might be like, there's supposed to be a mammal in here? And yes, the answer is yes, because you, my friends, are mammals. So we share some characteristics in common with our sea otter friends that may be a little bit, some can be kind of obvious, and some might be a little bit more tricky to think about when we're just looking at ourselves and comparing ourselves to sea otters. Now, there are 5 main characteristics that make a mammal. The first thing that makes a mammal is the presence of like hair or fur. So if we go back to our picture of our sea otter friends, you can see they have this nice thick coat of fur, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail later on. But then take a look at us. We also got hair or fur. Now, even things that may not look like they have hair or fur throughout their life are also considered mammals. And so one of the more interesting examples of this is a whale. So whales are also an example of a marine mammal, but when you take a look at them, they don't really look like they have any hair. But when they're tiny, different kinds of whales and dolphins will have sort of like little whiskers that they have. And those are very important for another characteristic of a mammal, which is that they need to get milk from their mom. So there's some parental care, some care from their moms that goes into raising a mammal like us. And then also, sort of going along with that, is that we are not like birds, for example, that hatched out of an egg, right? So mammals also give live birth. Now, there's one final characteristic that makes a mammal, and that is being warm-blooded. So maybe you've heard of being warm-blooded or cold-blooded before, and maybe you're not exactly sure what those terms mean. And even saying warm versus cold-blooded can be a little bit tricky, but what it really means is that if you're cold-blooded, for example, like maybe a reptile, they need to rely on their environment to either warm up or cool down. But for us, we are warm-blooded, so that means that we can regulate our body temperature no matter where we are. Maybe you've gone to the snow before, and yeah, maybe you want to put on a jacket or something, but we can go into all these different kinds of environments because we're warm-blooded. And so as long as we're healthy, we can maintain our body temperature and keep it consistent no matter where we go. And so that's another final characteristic, or the final characteristic, of what makes a mammal. Now, us, of course, we don't spend our life out in the ocean. I mean, maybe you've gone to the beach before and explored the tide pools, or maybe one day you want to learn how to scuba dive. So we can explore our marine environment, but of course, we don't spend our whole lives there. So that is the marine portion of the phrase marine mammal. And so let's go ahead and talk more about our friends, the sea otters. Maybe we can take another look at them real quick. We can throw them up on the screen. I'm going to actually, I don't need to step off. He's right here. So go ahead. Let's take some initial observations. Just think about what things you notice. And remember, we would love to hear from you. So go ahead and feel free to text us at that number, or you can also email us at live@lbaop, or once again, text us at 562-286-1838. So go ahead and take a look at our sea otter friend. Maybe you can spot some of those characteristics. Like I said, definitely got a nice coat of fur that we're going to talk about here. Now, sea otters are related to things like wolverines and badgers, and so they are sort of a very rambunctious animal. Here at the aquarium, we have a group of sea otters, and they're a whole lot of fun to watch, but there really is a whole lot more to them than just that adorable little face that you can see right here. Now, in the wild, sea otters live about 10 to 15 years or so. In an aquarium setting under human care, they can actually live a few years longer than that. We've had a couple that have gone past the 20-year mark, which is pretty cool. But sea otters, but the sea otters in the wild actually have a very unique habitat where they are very, very important. So now I actually want to switch gears and take a look about where you would find some sea otters out in the wild. So I'm gonna go ahead and step off. Let's take some observations. Maybe you've seen this type of habitat before or heard about this type of habitat. Go ahead and take some observations, see what kind of things you notice, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. Maybe you can see that the sun is shining through there, so maybe it's not in the deep, deep ocean. All that stuff that you see floating around like that, that is called kelp. And so what we're looking at is a kelp forest. So almost like a rainforest on land, we actually have these forests right underwater. And in these environments, just like a rainforest where there's tons of different animals that live in each different part, maybe some that live up in the trees, down below, just like that, in a kelp forest, you have hundreds of different kinds of fish, invertebrates, and some mammals like our sea otters who reside in these kelp forests. Now, the way that these animals use kelp is going to be different depending on what kind it is. Kelp might be food for some animals, it might be a hiding spot for others, and because it's this real hotspot of biodiversity where there's so many different kind of animals, it also means that there's, for example, lots of food maybe for our sea otter friends. Now, what is kelp though? Because I think that's kind of cool to talk about real quick, because kelp is super, super important. Without the kelp, we don't have this beautiful ecosystem that the sea otters rely on. And so real quick, I actually want to show you something pretty cool. Maybe if we go to our live cam of our blue cavern, we can see another portion of the kelp forest that I want to sort of point out. So now that we've sort of taken this top-down view, one of the things that's probably going to catch your eye is maybe that leopard shark that is swimming by, or some of the other fish that you see cruising along there. But if we take a look at the habitat itself, in addition to the kelp, you may notice that there's lots of rocks all around at the bottom and all around the sides. And that is really, really important because kelp, although it looks a lot like a plant and it behaves a whole lot like a plant, it's different in a couple key ways. And one of the ways is that since it's not a true plant, it's actually a type of algae, it doesn't have roots that bury into the soil like plants here on land. Instead, it has this thing called a holdfast, which I actually have right here. And this really cool little net of a holdfast of giant kelp grips itself to the rocks. And so the fact that there's these rocky habitats is very important sort of to build the foundation of a kelp forest. And so if you take a look where the kelp sits attached to the rocks, you're going to see this cool structure called a holdfast here. Now, another characteristic of the kelp forest that's very important is that it needs really cold, nutrient-rich waters in order to grow. And that cold temperature, although very good for the kelp, can pose some challenges to animals. And so now we're going to switch gears and talk about how sea otters survive in water that's cold just about all year long. And so one of the ways that they do that, actually, let's just take a look at one first. Now, I mentioned earlier that another example of a marine mammal was a whale. And maybe if you've heard of whales or you've seen whales, they are gigantic animals for the most part, right? And so they have some other adaptations that they have in order to stay warm because just like sea otters, they are spending their whole lives out in the ocean. You can see a humpback here. So quite a huge animal. Maybe you've been lucky enough to see one on a whale watch or something. But whales, like the humpback whale, have a cool adaptation called blubber. So they have these thick layers of fat that they use to stay warm out in the ocean because just like sea otters, they're going to go through, while some might spend time in warm water, they are going to have to spend a portion of their time in some cooler waters. Now, if we switch gears back to our sea otters, you'll notice that they're definitely not giant like our whale friends, right? They're much, much smaller. This picture is quite adorable. So they don't have these thick layers of blubber to stay warm, so they need to come up with some other tricks in order to stay warm out in those cold kelp forests. Now, one of the ways they do this is maybe not so obvious, and that actually has to do with their diet. Now, I mentioned the kelp forest is in the shallow waters, right? We saw that beautiful sunlight coming through, and so the water is relatively shallow. So otters are not the best swimmers. They don't go on super long dives like some whales do. They do short little dives where they're actually going to swim down to the bottom and grab different kind of food items. Now, I want everyone to sort of think, maybe we can go back to the blue cavern cam real quick, and maybe we can take a look back at the habitat, and I want everyone to sort of take some observations and maybe some guesses about what you think a sea otter might like to munch on. And also, once again, my friends, if you would like to share your observations with us, we would love to hear from you. So let's go ahead and take a look back at our kelp forest habitat here. Now, as we're looking at this, especially from this view, you're going to see lots of fish. Oh, in the bottom right there, there's one of our largest fish, the giant sea bass. And so at first you might think, maybe these sea otters really, really like to eat fish. That would be a great guess. But like I said, sea otters are not very, very good swimmers. At least they're not as fast as some other things. And so fish who are very, very good at swimming are going to get away rather quickly. But instead, sea otters are going to dive all the way down to the bottom, and they're going to look for invertebrates, different kinds of invertebrates. Now, maybe you've heard that word before, but invertebrates are animals that don't have a backbone. They don't have bones like you and I, or like our sea otter friends. And they come in all different kinds of shapes and sizes. So invertebrates can be anything from like sea jellies to octopuses to crabs to all sorts of things. And so sea otters are going to like to munch on different kind of invertebrates. Now, I actually want to step over to our little document cam and show you a close-up of some of the food items that a sea otter might like to munch on. And so if we step over here, I'm going to pull up some cool shells that we can take a look at here. I'll get them in view. So sea otters can be, some of them can be a little picky. Sometimes they'll actually pick up diets from their parents, but their diet might span all sorts of things, like maybe even some clams or other shelled items like this. So we can take a look at that. It might also include something as strange as like a sea star. Maybe you've been like, what? I didn't know anything eats a sea star. But yeah, sea stars might occasionally munch on them. And you can see a sea star here. And it also might include other things too, like some squid or octopuses if they're able to catch them. But there's one sea item, or one food item in particular, that sea otters love to munch on that sort of ties in with why they're so important to the kelp forest. So let's go ahead and maybe we can look at a picture of another food item that sea otters like to eat. Aha! So this, my friends, is a sea urchin. Go ahead, I'll step off for just a second. Take some observations about our sea urchin here and see what you notice. Because at first glance, it may not look super appealing, right? It's got these big spines sticking out. It's sort of, in this case, sort of attached to a rocky surface there. So maybe at first glance you're thinking, how might a sea otter eat this thing that is covered with these big spines? Now, sea otters are very, very smart and crafty animals. So like I just showed you over there too, things like clams and other shelled items at first might be very hard to break into, or even like a crab have these hard exoskeletons. They're skeletons on the outside. And so sea otters are very crafty. Maybe we can take back a look at that picture of the one real quick with the food item on its chest. So what they do is they're going to go dive down all the way to the bottom, gather all the food that they can find, and then they bring it up to the top. And they use their belly sort of like a dinner plate, like you can see here. And they will even use things like rocks as tools to break open hard-shelled items in order to get to all the meat inside that they want to munch on. Okay, let's go back to our sea urchin friend for just a second here. Now, in the same way, sea urchins have these big exoskeleton, or not big, but they have these hard exoskeletons that actually, if we go back to the document cam, I have one for you that we can check out. So underneath all of those spiny outside is what's called a test, or sort of a skeleton of a sea urchin. And so all these little circles and rows that you see here are where all those spines will point out from. And of course, in some of those urchins, they can get pretty big. Now, if we go back to our urchin, You may notice one more thing about it, and that is that it's munching, so it's currently eating, on some kelp, some of the giant kelp that we looked at earlier from a kelp forest. Now, sea urchins, although they're small, they have quite a big diet. They love to munch on kelp. And so if their populations are left unchecked, they can actually decimate kelp forests, eat away at it entirely, because their favorite part, or one of their favorite parts of the kelp, is that holdfast that I mentioned. So if they eat away at this holdfast, then the rest of the kelp can drift away. And so if that happens, urchins can create these sort of ecosystems called urchin barrens, where the kelp has been gone, and now you just have tons and tons of urchins all over the rocky habitat. Now, that's where sea otters come into play. Because they're one of the few animals that loves to eat sea urchins, they can actually go down and eat a bunch of urchins and help to keep the populations in check. Now, this is what makes sea otters known as a keystone species. And what that means is that in many of these ecosystems, there's a very delicate balance, right? There's complex food chains and food webs and different things eating different things. But if you remove any of those key players, like a sea otter, then you can throw it completely out of balance. If we remove the sea otters from the kelp forest habitat, then the urchins can continue to munch away at the kelp and, again, create those urchin barrens. So in a way, sea otters are sort of the guardians of the kelp forest. Now, sea otters, although tiny, have a very, very big diet. And I mentioned earlier that the kelp forest has really cold water, so instead of blubber, they're going to need to come up with some other adaptations to help deal with that. And that diet, although quite varied, is very important, because they will eat about 25% of their body weight every single day. Now, to sort of put that into perspective, maybe you can think about how much you weigh, and you would have to eat a cheeseburger for every pound you weigh every single day. So that is a ton of food. But that's because sea otters have a very high metabolism. They're processing that food very, very quickly, but it helps to make sure that they can keep their body temperature where it needs to be. Okay, so that's one of the adaptations that sea otters have in order to survive out in the kelp forest, but they have another cool trick up their sleeve, which we've talked about just a little bit, and that is, of course, that thick, thick fur that you can see on our friend here. So kind of one of the funny things about sea otters, too, is you can sort of not completely, but you can sort of estimate if a sea otter is on the older or the younger end too by the color of their coat. So when they're young and they're tiny, they have a nice solid brown coat. But as they get older, kind of like people, sometimes our hair turns gray. And that's true for sea otters too, which I think is kind of funny. But that thick layer of fur is a little bit special because it is actually the thickest or most dense fur in the animal kingdom. So of all the animals in the world, they have the thickest fur. So, again, no blubber, they're tiny. Let's use that thick coat of fur instead. And so actually, if we go back to our document cam real quick, I think it'd be kind of cool to show you. We have a little sample of this really, really dense otter fur here. And so you can see that there's just tons and tons of fur here. It is super, super thick. And because of that, the skin of the sea otter doesn't really actually get wet. What this fur does is it traps little air bubbles in here that keep it sort of like a layer of air that the sea otter can warm up in order to keep its body temperature nice and warm. And so if you ever come to the aquarium and you see our little sea otter friends swimming around, you'll often see that when they go dive that they'll leave sort of a bubble trail behind. And that's sort of like having a built-in dry suit, like some scuba divers when they go diving in cold water use a dry suit. It's sort of just like this, except that's all thanks to that really thick fur. Now, unfortunately, their thick fur, though, did get them into a little bit of trouble. So back in the about mid-1700s or so quite a while ago, the sea otters used to be in the many, many thousands, and their range extended all the way from about Baja California, all the way up to Alaska, and all the way around to Japan. So there was lots and lots of sea otters. But back then, humans didn't have a lot of the sort of like fake furs that we use for different kind of clothing items. And so sea otters, because they have this really nice thick fur, they were hunted for their fur. And they were hunted in really, really drastic ways. And so their populations actually crashed completely. So they went from many, many thousands to actually a population of about, or less than 50. So only a handful of otters had remained. And so they were in trouble. Now, in order to help them out, one of the things that we did is we stopped that fur trade. So by banning the fur trade, they were no longer hunted, but this wasn't until the early 1900s. So a lot of the damage had unfortunately already been done. But sea otters were then protected from hunting for their fur, and we've also put in protections like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which has protected not only sea otters, but all of our marine mammal friends in our ocean here in the US. Now, thankfully, because of that, since they're no longer hunted, their populations have slowly started to come back, but they're not really near where they used to be. So like I mentioned before, there was many, many thousand. Where we are right now is approximately around 3,000. So of course that is much, much better than 50, but we still need to help and make sure that our sea otter friends can continue to build their populations. And so one of the cool things that's going on right now, I'll step off so we can once again check out our adorable little sea otter here. One of the things that we did to, again, help out our sea otter friends is through a Sea Otter Rehabilitation program, or a Sea Otter surrogacy program. And so what this means is that if there are any stranded sea otter pups out in the wild, so actually I should probably say that, so remember when I talked about their giant range where they would go all the way from Baja to Japan? So their range is pretty small now too. You can find southern sea otters, which are the kind of sea otters we have here at the aquarium, mainly around Central California, and that's mostly it. But we can find, and we partner with actually the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which is closer to their area. And if they ever find any stranded pups that need help, they can actually bring them in and teach them the skills that they need to use in order to hopefully re-release them in the wild. And so the way that we do that, or the way that Monterey Bay, as well as us, helps to have these stranded pups learn the skills they need is by pairing them with a surrogate mom. And so a surrogate mom is an adult otter who knows the skills needed to survive out in the wild. And so by pairing them up, having the adult mom sea otter, she can actually teach them how to forage, how to clean their fur, all of these important skills that are necessary in order to survive. And so in many cases, if it's successful, the human contact has been sort of minimized, the adult has taught them everything they need to do, we can release these sea otters back into the wild to help boost their populations even further. Now here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, we are a new partner to Monterey Bay, so just in the last couple of years, but we are super excited. Here's our Sea Otter habitat here at the aquarium. And so we are having our adult sea otters learn how to be those surrogate moms, which is really cool. So currently we have 3 sea otter pups that were rescued. Now, there are some cases where a sea otter pup might be unreleasable for one reason or another. Maybe it has a health issue, maybe it's too comfortable with people, it didn't quite learn how to forage on its own. And so just to make sure that the sea otter is able to survive, and we don't want to send it back out in the wild if it doesn't seem prepared to do so, right? So sometimes they're unreleasable and they will spend time or they will live their life at an aquarium like ours. So we have 3 pups at the moment, and they are super adorable. And they have been paired up with some of our adult otters in order to teach our adults how to be good moms. And so it's going pretty successfully. Some of our sea otters are learning the skills to be a good surrogate mom. And so in the future, we're going to be helping Monterey Bay Aquarium to rehabilitate and re-release some southern sea otters back into our ecosystems. And so if you come to visit us at the aquarium right now, you can actually see our 3 otter pups. They're on exhibit with our adults. And then we also have a new area being developed where we're going to have some new pups in the future to hopefully re-release them back into the wild, which is really cool. Now we'll take a look here at this adorable video. You can see those big chompers that sea otters have, because as carnivores, they have those big teeth there to help them eat. But they are, of course, super adorable, fun to watch, and like I said, very important to their ecosystems. Now, there's one other way that we've also helped to protect these sea otters, which I want to talk about very quickly. Maybe if we switch back to our Kelp Forest ecosystem, I want to talk about one final way that we can help out our sea otters. So if we go back to our Kelp Forest here, I want to talk about what are called marine protected areas, or MPAs. And so what these zones are, they're designated areas where human impacts are minimized. So maybe there's no fishing allowed, no boating allowed, there are no take zones, so you can't take anything from it. And we've designated some of these areas in California and around the world as marine protected areas to create these sort of safe havens, these safe places for all these animals that rely on the kelp forest. Now, our exhibit here, Blue Cavern, is modeled after a real dive site on Catalina Island, and this is an example of a marine protected area. And so when you have these safe places where there's no fishing or anything, that of course means that we're going to have lots and lots of healthy ecosystems, lots and lots of food available for our sea otters. And so by designating these areas, it is good for the fish, for the invertebrates, and then of course for our sea otters. So not only protecting them by doing those rehabilitations or by stopping the fur trade, things like that, we can also sort of indirectly help to conserve our sea otters by protecting the habitat itself. Ooh, it looks like we do have a question, and the question is, how long do otter pups stay with their moms? That is a fantastic question. Now, sea otter pups, I believe they stay with their mom for approximately 1-ish year, maybe even a little bit longer in some cases, but there definitely is some heavy parental investment in that first year or two of their life. Because like I said, even the ones that we have here who are teaching their pups to forage and have all those skills, in the wild, the moms are teaching them that too. So they will stay with them for the first year or two of their life in order to make sure that they have the skills to survive out there in the wild. Thank you for that question. That is an awesome question. Thanks for sending it our way. We're happy to hear from you guys. So yeah, well, looks like we have a couple minutes here. Let's go ahead and take some other observations. Maybe we can throw up another adorable sea otter video here and sort of wrap up and talk about just once again all the things we have discussed here today. So this, such an adorable picture. It really never gets old to see just how cute these sea otters are. So of course, what did we talk about today? We know that sea otters are an example of a marine mammal. We quickly went over their characteristics about what makes a mammal, and we talked about how long they live in the wild, right? So about 10 to 15 years, and we also had a great question about how long the pups stay with their mom, which is usually the first couple years of their life. And then we also talked about their habitat, right? The beautiful kelp forest that we have, for example, even here off of our coast of California. And we talked about some of the tricks that sea otters have up their sleeve in order to stay warm out there in the cold waters of the kelp forest. And that includes their very thick fur and also that huge diet. If you take a look at this video here, you can see, looks like one of them has a toy that they're playing with, but there's also some food being tossed to them. Now that's actually really cool. Did you see the one on the left? Maybe when it loops back, take a look at the one that's on the left side. It's going to take that bright pink toy and do something with it. Let's see if we can watch that again. Do you see it banging up against the window there? Now, although banging it up against our exhibit windows may not be the best thing for the acrylic itself, that sort of skill of banging that toy up against a hard surface like that is kind of like how they will use those rocks and tools to break open those hard-shelled items. So that's actually a good indication they're doing some of those natural behaviors too. And then we also talked today about their diet, what sea otters like to eat. We now know that they like to hunt invertebrates, all different kinds, including the sea urchin, which is what makes them a keystone species, meaning that they are sort of the guardians of the kelp forest, helping to keep those sea otter populations in check. Now, it looks like we got one more question, and it says, why do otters get dog toys? Now, they get all sorts of toys. Some of them do sort of look like dog toys, but we give them all sorts of different things, anything from like that little, like the ball you saw, even these little toy keys, just all sorts of different shaped items for them to play with so that they can make sure that we are stimulating their brains, keeping them enriched, and keeping them nice and happy. So thank you for that question. So thank you for joining us today here with our Sea Otter Conservation Program. Hopefully you learned something new about our amazing marine mammal friends, the sea otters. Teachers, if you are joining us today with a class, we would love to hear about how many students you had tuning in with us today. So if you could, please text us at 562-286-1838. And if you do have any questions that you think of after our program is done today, that's okay. You can email them to live@lbaop.org, and we will be sure to get back to you and answer your question. So thank you all once again. Have a wonderful day today, and we'll see you again soon for another episode of the Aquarium Online Academy.